Power doesn't disappear by accident. It disappears because someone decided they had the right to touch something that never belonged to them. The smell of scorched insulation reached me before I even stepped out of my truck. It wasn't strong, just enough to make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. After 19 years designing and maintaining electrical infrastructure across Colorado, I knew that smell better than fresh coffee in the morning. It meant somebody had been inside a live utility corridor who had absolutely no business being there. I killed the engine, grabbed my hard hat from the passenger seat out of habit, and followed the gravel path toward the transformer easement that crossed the edge of my property. The late afternoon wind carried the faint buzz of distant power lines, except one familiar sound was missing. The steady hum that normally drifted across my backyard had gone completely silent. Silence around energized equipment is never comforting. It's a warning. My boots crunched across loose granite until I rounded the old cedar tree my father planted nearly 30 years ago. That's when I saw it. Thick aluminum conductors lay coiled across the grass like discarded rope, both ends sliced clean with hydraulic cable cutters. Fresh scrape marks scarred the utility pedestal, and bright copper strands reflected the setting sun where protective shielding had been ripped away only hours earlier. Whoever had done this hadn't been careful. They'd been confident. There was even a pile of trimmed branches stacked neatly beside the easement, almost as if they wanted credit for cleaning up after themselves. Then I noticed the laminated notice zip tied to the pedestal. Community Infrastructure Improvement. Unauthorized utility installation removed by order of the HOA. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so unbelievably reckless that my brain refused to process it any other way. My name is Nathan Caldwell. I'm 41 years old, a licensed utility infrastructure engineer, and I've spent nearly 2 decades making sure people never have to think about where electricity comes from. If the lights turn on, I've done my job. If they don't, somebody like me gets the phone call. My little property sat just outside the boundaries of Silver Ridge Estates, a picture-perfect subdivision filled with oversized homes, polished SUVs, and an HOA that believed every inch of land within eyesight somehow belonged under its authority. I deliberately bought this place because it wasn't governed by their covenants, and because it included something most buyers overlooked, a recorded utility easement dating back to 1989. To everyone else, it looked like an ordinary strip of grass running behind my workshop. To me, it was one of the most important pieces of infrastructure in the entire neighborhood. I knelt beside the severed cable and brushed my fingers across the smooth cut. The metal was still warm from the afternoon sun, but the insulation carried another scent beneath the plastic and dust. Fresh hydraulic oil. Whoever cut these lines had used professional equipment, not a pair of hardware store bolt cutters. They hadn't stumbled into a mistake. They had planned it. As I stood up, my phone vibrated with 3 missed calls from the regional utility dispatcher. Before I could call back, every porch light across Silver Ridge Estates flickered once in the distance, and then the entire neighborhood disappeared into darkness. Nobody stepped outside at first. That was the strange part. Hundreds of homes had just gone dark, yet every front door stayed closed as if people expected someone else to solve the problem. I looked across the valley at the blacked-out streets and slowly slipped my phone back into my pocket. The regional dispatcher was still trying to reach me, but I already knew what they were going to ask. They would want to know whether I had noticed anything unusual around the recorded easement feeding the subdivision. The answer was sitting 10 feet away, tied to a utility pedestal with a bright white notice sign by people who clearly believed landscaping authority and electrical infrastructure were the same thing. They were not. I bought this property 12 years earlier because I understood maps that most real estate agents never bothered to read. While everyone else admired granite, countertops, and mountain views, I spent 2 hours reviewing survey drawings, county filings, and utility easement records. Buried in those documents was a permanent right-of-way established in 1989 that allowed the electric cooperative to route primary distribution equipment across the back corner of my land. It did not make me the owner of the electrical system, but it gave me legal rights that could not be erased by neighborhood rules or decorative landscaping projects. Most people never notice easements until they want to build a fence. I built my entire purchase around one. My father used to tell me that invisible things often mattered more than visible ones. Underground pipes, fiber optic cables, high voltage feeders. They rarely received attention until somebody interrupted them. He spent 30 years as a surveyor, and every summer break when I was a teenager, I followed him through fields carrying stakes and measuring tape, while he explained property boundaries that existed only on paper but controlled millions of dollars in real life. That is probably why I became an infrastructure engineer instead of chasing skyscrapers or bridges. I liked the systems people depended on without ever thinking about them. Electricity rewarded patience. It followed rules whether people respected those rules or not. My workshop had never been flashy. A modest metal building, shelves filled with testing equipment, rolled utility drawings, insulated gloves, and enough replacement components to fix almost anything on my own property. I preferred spending Saturday mornings calibrating meters over arguing with neighbors about mailbox colors. Unfortunately, Silver Ridge Estates had never shared that philosophy. Ever since Victoria Ashcroft became president of the Homeowners Association 3 years earlier, the neighborhood had developed a habit of confusing confidence with authority. She loved meetings, committees, inspection notices, and official-sounding letters printed on expensive paper. Every conversation somehow ended with the same sentence. Everything inside these gates belongs to the Homeowners Association. The first time she said it to me, I smiled and pointed toward the county survey marker sitting 30 yards beyond her entrance sign. She smiled back as if facts were simply opinions waiting to be outvoted. Standing beside those freshly severed conductors, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. Victoria had never bothered to learn the difference between neighborhood property and public utility infrastructure. Worse, she had apparently found contractors willing to believe her. The dispatcher called again, and this time I answered. Before I could say my name, the voice on the other end spoke 3 words that confirmed every suspicion forming in my mind. Nathan, do not touch anything. The dispatcher kept his voice calm, but I could hear keyboards clicking and radios chattering in the background. That only happened when an outage had already been escalated beyond a routine service interruption. He asked me one question. Did anyone disturb the primary feeder running across your easement today? I looked at the severed conductors, the scraped utility pedestal, and the notice still hanging from the cable support. Yes, I answered, and I think I know exactly who authorized it. There was a pause that lasted just long enough for him to understand the seriousness of what I was saying. Stay where you are, he replied. Our field supervisor is on the way. Do not reconnect anything. Do not move any evidence. I told him I had no intention of touching a single inch of it. The truth was, every instinct I had as an engineer wanted to start documenting the entire site before rain or curious neighbors contaminated it. Instead, I pulled out my phone and began taking photographs from every angle exactly as the equipment rested. Wide shots first, then close-ups of the clean hydraulic cuts, the warning labels, the exposed conductor ends, the fresh tire impressions pressed into the damp soil beside the easement. Experience had taught me that details disappear faster than memories. 10 minutes later, the silence around the neighborhood began changing. Garage doors tried to open before stopping halfway. Backup alarms chirped from home security systems switching to battery power. Somewhere in the distance, a generator started, then another one, each producing a slightly different rhythm until the quiet valley sounded like an uneven orchestra warming up. I walked toward the property line overlooking Silver Ridge Estates and saw porch lights still dark from one end of the subdivision to the other. Then I spotted movement. Victoria Ashcroft was standing near the entrance monument speaking with 3 board members, confidently pointing toward different streets, as if directing traffic. Even from several hundred feet away, her posture looked exactly the same as every homeowners association meeting I had ever attended. Shoulders straight, chin high, one hand holding a clipboard like it carried more authority than state law. I remembered our first conversation after I moved in. She had arrived with a welcome packet and a list of suggested improvements for a property that was not even governed by her association. She complimented my landscaping, questioned my workshop, commented on my utility trailer, and politely informed me that visible infrastructure reduced neighborhood appeal. I thanked her for the information and explained that every pole, pedestal, and marker she disliked belonged either to the electric cooperative or to recorded easements protected by county filings. She smiled as though I had simply misunderstood the rules. Over the years, she sent letters asking me to relocate equipment that was permanently fixed, paint utility cabinets that did not belong to me, and remove survey stakes installed by licensed professionals. I always responded the same way. I attached copies of public records instead of opinions. Eventually, the letters stopped, but the inspections never did. Looking at her now, surrounded by frustrated residents staring at dark houses, I realized something else. She genuinely believed this outage was someone else's mistake. She had absolutely no idea that the contractor she hired had crossed from cosmetic landscaping into regulated electrical infrastructure. That confidence would not survive the evening. A white utility pickup rolled onto the shoulder beside my driveway, with amber warning lights flashing slowly across the trees. Behind it came another truck from the county and a marked vehicle from the Electric Cooperative's Investigations Unit. None of them drove toward the neighborhood entrance. Every one of them turned directly onto my property. The first person out of the lead truck was not a repair technician carrying tools. He was an investigations supervisor carrying a camera, a clipboard, and a stack of evidence markers. That alone told me the outage had already crossed from maintenance into documentation. He introduced himself, shook my hand, and immediately asked me to walk him through everything exactly as I had found it. We started at the gravel driveway, followed my footprints to the utility pedestal, and stopped several feet short of the severed conductors. Nobody stepped inside the disturbed area. Nobody touched the cable. Every photograph was taken before measurements began. They documented the tire tracks, the cut marks, the warning labels, and even the laminated notice that still fluttered against the pedestal in the evening breeze. One technician quietly removed a folded county easement map from his truck, compared the survey coordinates with a handheld receiver, and nodded without saying a word. Another radioed the dispatcher with a string of equipment numbers that matched the feeder listed in their records. I could tell from their expressions that everything they were seeing matched the official drawings perfectly. A few minutes later, another pickup arrived carrying representatives from the Electric Cooperative's Legal Compliance Division. They were not there to argue. They were there to establish facts. One of them asked whether I still had the original property survey from my closing documents. I told him I had both the paper copy and the digital file stored in my office. He smiled and said, "Please leave them where they are. We will retrieve everything after the site has been logged." That level of care confirmed something important. This was no longer just my problem. It had become an infrastructure investigation. Down the hill, Silver Ridge Estates was growing noticeably louder. Residents had gathered near the clubhouse with flashlights and battery lanterns, trying to figure out why every street remained dark while neighboring communities still glowed against the mountains. I watched Victoria Ashcroft walking from one small group to another with the same determined confidence she always carried, although now she seemed to be repeating herself more than listening. Every few moments, she pointed toward the county road, as if expecting another repair truck to arrive and magically restore everything. She still believed this was simply a power company delay. Then one of the investigators asked me a question that changed the entire direction of the evening. "Nathan, has the Homeowners Association ever questioned this easement before?" I almost laughed. "Several times," I answered. "Letters, inspection notices, requests to relocate equipment that was never theirs to relocate." He made a note without looking up. "Did you keep the correspondence?" "Every single page." He looked at me for the first time since opening his notebook. "Good. That establishes prior notice." Those two words settled heavily in the air. Prior notice meant this was not an accidental misunderstanding. It meant there was a documented history showing that information had already been provided before today's work was authorized. As the investigators continued recording measurements, another utility employee received a radio update and quietly shared it with the supervisor. The supervisor exhaled slowly before turning toward me. "The control center has confirmed the outage path," he said. "The neighborhood was being supplied through the exact feeder that was interrupted here. Until we complete the inspection and certify every damaged component, the entire circuit must remain isolated for public safety." I looked once more toward the dark subdivision where porch lights, security cameras, gate motors, and clubhouse windows all remained lifeless. For the first time that evening, I realized the biggest surprise was not that the lights had gone out. It was that the people responsible still had no idea they had caused it themselves. The investigation moved with the kind of quiet precision that only comes from people who have done the same job hundreds of times. Nobody rushed, yet every minute seemed to reveal another piece of the picture. One technician carefully traced the damaged feeder on a digital utility map, while another compared the field markings against archived construction drawings dating back more than 3 decades. I stood a respectful distance away, answering questions only when they were directed at me. Years in this industry had taught me that the fastest way to slow an investigation was to interrupt it with assumptions. Facts always arrive before conclusions. About 30 minutes after sunset, the field supervisor motioned me toward the tailgate of his truck where several laminated system diagrams were spread beneath a portable work light. He tapped a thick red line running across the map before stopping at the exact corner of my property. "This is the primary distribution feeder," he said. "Everything beyond this point depends on it." His finger continued across the page, passing through the recorded easement before branching into multiple neighborhood circuits. Street lighting, security gates, clubhouse service, irrigation controls, residential transformers. Everything flowed from the same protected corridor. Then he pointed to the section that had been cut earlier that afternoon. When this section was compromised, the control center immediately detected an abnormal condition. Until we verify every conductor, connector, and protective device, the entire feeder stays isolated. There is no safe shortcut. Even though I already understood the engineering behind it, hearing the explanation spoken aloud made the situation feel heavier. This was never about one damaged cable. It was about preserving the integrity of an entire electrical distribution system serving hundreds of families. A younger investigator approached carrying a tablet filled with property records. "Nathan," he asked, "did the Homeowners Association ever receive copies of these easement documents?" I nodded. "More than once. I personally mailed certified copies after they questioned the utility markers 2 years ago. They also received county references during a board meeting last spring." He scrolled through several files before looking up, with an expression that mixed surprise and disbelief. "The county logged those deliveries." I did not respond. There was nothing left to add. The paperwork was beginning to tell its own story. Down in the subdivision, emergency lighting had appeared outside the clubhouse, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Residents were gathering in small circles, checking their phones, opening garage doors manually, and trying to understand why restoration crews were working outside the neighborhood instead of inside it. Victoria Ashcroft eventually left the entrance and walked toward our location with determined steps, stopping just outside the temporary safety tape. She looked from one utility truck to another before focusing on the supervisor. "How much longer before the power is back?" she asked with the confidence of someone expecting a simple schedule update. The supervisor answered politely without raising his voice. "Ma'am, this location is now part of an active infrastructure investigation. Restoration cannot begin until documentation is complete and the damaged facilities have been certified safe." She frowned and gestured toward the severed cables. "Those old lines were supposed to be removed during our landscaping improvements." Nobody answered immediately. Instead, the legal compliance representative quietly lifted one of the county easement maps, turned it so everyone could see the highlighted corridor, and asked a single question. "Who informed your contractors that these energized utility facilities could be removed?" For the first time since I had met Victoria, she did not have an immediate response. The evening air became perfectly still, broken only by the distant hum of portable generators struggling to keep pieces of the neighborhood alive while the truth slowly emerged under the glow of investigation lights. Victoria looked at the highlighted easement map for several long seconds before answering. "Our landscaping committee approved clearing obsolete utility hardware," she finally said, carefully choosing each word. The legal compliance representative did not argue with her. Instead, he reached into a document case and produced a certified copy of the county easement filing. The pages were worn from years of handling, complete with recording stamps, survey references, and engineering notes dating back to 1989. He placed the document beside the laminated notice that had been attached to the utility pedestal only hours earlier. The contrast between the two papers could not have been clearer. One represented legally recorded infrastructure recognized by the county and the electric cooperative. The other was a neighborhood notice printed that morning. Nobody needed to explain which one carried authority. Victoria glanced toward the board members standing behind her, but none of them stepped forward. One investigator quietly asked whether the Homeowners Association had retained the contractor who performed the work. After a brief hesitation, One of the board members admitted they had hired a landscaping company to improve the appearance of the entrance corridor before the annual community open house. The crew had apparently been instructed to remove anything considered unnecessary or unattractive near the property line. Utility markers, protective posts, warning signs. Even the pedestal had been marked for relocation. The field supervisor slowly closed his notebook. That explains why the warning placards were detached, he said. It does not explain why energized infrastructure was altered without utility authorization. Nobody answered. The only sounds came from portable generators echoing through the dark subdivision and the occasional radio transmission from the control center updating restoration status. I remained where I had been since the investigation began, saying very little. Years of working with infrastructure failures had taught me that emotions disappear from official reports, but photographs, measurements, and recorded timelines remain forever. The investigation team asked permission to review my exterior security cameras. My workshop maintained several high-definition cameras covering the driveway, equipment yard, and utility corridor because expensive testing instruments were stored inside. Within minutes, we were standing around a monitor inside my office watching footage from earlier that afternoon. At exactly 2:17, 2 pickup trucks carrying landscaping equipment entered the edge of my property. The video clearly showed workers examining the warning markers before unloading hydraulic cutting equipment. None of them contacted the utility company. None attempted to verify ownership. At 2:29, one worker held up the laminated Homeowners Association notice while another secured it to the pedestal. Less than 5 minutes later, the feeder was cut. The room became completely silent as the recording continued. At 2:36, every worker packed their equipment, drove away, and left the site exactly as I had discovered it. The timestamp left no room for speculation. One investigator immediately requested copies of the footage, while another photographed the monitor displaying the original recording. The chain of evidence was documented with the same careful precision used throughout the evening. Outside, more residents had gathered near the temporary safety perimeter, whispering among themselves as bits of information slowly spread through the crowd. They had spent hours assuming the outage resulted from equipment failure somewhere far away. Now they were beginning to understand that the interruption had started less than 100 yards from where they stood. The legal compliance representative closed his folder and looked toward the dark neighborhood stretching across the hillside. "This restoration will happen," he said calmly. "But first we have to make certain every damaged component is replaced, every inspection is completed, and every responsibility is accurately documented." I watched the investigation vehicles continue their work beneath the portable lights and realized the evening had reached a point where the electrical repairs were no longer the biggest story. The evidence itself was beginning to illuminate everything the darkness had hidden. By 9 o'clock that evening, the investigation had shifted from gathering evidence to reconstructing the entire sequence of events. Every vehicle movement, every document, every phone call, and every recorded timestamp was being assembled into a timeline that left almost no room for interpretation. I watched as the electric cooperative's investigators compared my security footage with dispatch records showing the exact second protective relays detected the fault on the feeder. The two timelines matched almost perfectly. Less than 1 minute separated the final hydraulic cut from the automatic isolation of the distribution circuit. One investigator quietly remarked that he rarely saw evidence line up so cleanly. That was when another utility truck arrived, carrying the contractor who had supervised the landscaping crew. He stepped out looking confused rather than defensive, holding a folder filled with work orders and printed instructions. After introducing himself, he immediately asked whether anyone had been injured. The investigators assured him everyone was safe before requesting his paperwork. As he flipped through the pages, his expression gradually changed. There were diagrams showing shrubs scheduled for removal, decorative stone borders, and irrigation adjustments. But there was also one handwritten instruction circled in red ink. "Remove utility structures along property edge for improved appearance." He frowned at the note before saying something that instantly caught everyone's attention. "We asked whether these facilities belonged to the utility company. We were told they were abandoned and that the association had already approved removal." Nobody interrupted him. The investigators simply asked who had provided that information. Without hesitation, he pointed toward the Homeowners Association board members standing several yards away. The legal compliance representative carefully documented the statement before requesting copies of every work order, invoice, and email related to the project. Meanwhile, another investigator finished reviewing archived correspondence between me and the association. He organized the letters in chronological order across the hood of his truck. The first explained the recorded easement. The second included county survey references. The third attached utility contact information and warned that no infrastructure should ever be relocated without authorization from the electric cooperative. Seeing those documents arranged side by side made one fact impossible to ignore. The association had not acted without information. They had acted despite receiving it. News spread through the neighborhood faster than any official announcement could have managed. Residents who had spent the evening frustrated with the power company slowly gathered near the temporary perimeter, reading expressions instead of headlines. Conversations changed tone. Instead of asking when electricity would return, people began asking who approved the project in the first place. Several homeowners quietly approached the investigators to ask whether copies of public records would eventually become available. Others stared toward the dark clubhouse where emergency lanterns cast long shadows across the empty parking lot. Victoria Ashcroft remained unusually quiet. The confidence that had defined every previous encounter seemed to dissolve as each new document was placed into evidence. She occasionally attempted to explain that the project had only been intended to improve neighborhood appearance, but every explanation was followed by another record showing warnings that had already been provided months or even years earlier. Shortly before 10 o'clock, the lead investigator closed the final evidence case and spoke to everyone gathered nearby. He explained that restoration crews would begin replacing the damaged facilities as soon as the investigation released the work area, but the documentation process had to be completed first because utility infrastructure could not simply be repaired without preserving the facts that led to the failure. Standing there beneath the glow of portable work lights, I realized something my father had tried to teach me decades earlier. Boundaries drawn on paper often seem invisible until someone ignores them. Then they become impossible for anyone to overlook. The repair crews did not begin replacing the damaged feeder until the investigators officially released the work area just after midnight. Floodlights illuminated the easement, while specialized line technicians carefully removed every compromised section, documenting each component before installing new conductors, connectors, and protective hardware. Watching them work reminded me why I had chosen this profession. There was no shouting, no rushing, and no guessing. Every step followed procedure because electricity rewards discipline and punishes shortcuts. The neighborhood remained dark for several more hours, but this time everyone understood why. Safety came before convenience. Around sunrise, the legal compliance representative walked over carrying a folder that had grown noticeably thicker since the previous evening. He thanked me for preserving every letter, survey, photograph, and security recording over the years. Then he explained something I had suspected but never wanted to assume. The investigation had confirmed multiple documented notices proving the homeowners association had been informed that the recorded easement contained active utility infrastructure protected by county filings and cooperative regulations. Those notices, combined with contractor statements, security footage, dispatch records, and engineering documentation, established a clear timeline showing that the work had been authorized despite repeated warnings. He did not speculate about penalties or legal outcomes. He simply stated that the complete report would be forwarded to the appropriate departments for review. Later that morning, residents gathered outside the clubhouse as temporary power was restored to essential community equipment through portable distribution units, while permanent repairs continued. Conversations sounded very different from the night before. Nobody blamed the electric cooperative anymore. Instead, homeowners quietly compared copies of association newsletters, maintenance announcements, and meeting minutes, trying to understand how a landscaping project had expanded into protected utility property. Several people approached me individually, not to apologize on behalf of the association, but to ask questions about easements they admitted they had never fully understood. I spent nearly an hour explaining that recorded utility corridors exist to protect everyone because reliable infrastructure depends on consistent access, accurate records, and respect for boundaries that are often invisible until maintenance becomes necessary. Many nodded with genuine curiosity, surprised that something hidden beneath ordinary grass could affect an entire neighborhood. Near the entrance, Victoria Ashcroft stood beside several board members speaking with attorneys and insurance representatives. She looked exhausted rather than angry. The certainty that had once defined every conversation was gone, replaced by careful listening as professionals reviewed documents one page at a time. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. The paperwork carried enough weight on its own. By late afternoon, the electric cooperative completed the final inspections. Protective devices were tested, every replacement connection was verified, insulation readings met specification, and the rebuilt feeder passed every required standard before authorization was given to restore permanent service. One by one, porch lights blinked back to life across Silver Ridge Estates. Garage doors responded normally. Security cameras restarted. The clubhouse windows glowed again, reflecting the mountain sunset that everyone had missed the previous evening. Standing beside the freshly installed utility pedestal, I realized the biggest victory had never been about seeing the lights return. It was watching the truth emerge through patience instead of confrontation. Every photograph, every survey marker, every certified letter, every recorded timestamp, and every quiet decision to document rather than argue had become another piece of a story that no opinion could rewrite. Infrastructure had been repaired, but something even more important had been restored as well. Respect for boundaries that existed long before any homeowners association meeting and would remain long after the board members changed. 3 months later, the fresh utility pedestal had already faded into the landscape, looking as ordinary as every piece of infrastructure people passed without noticing. New grass had grown over the disturbed soil, the warning markers stood exactly where they belonged, and the steady hum of electricity once again drifted across the back of my property every evening. If someone had driven by for the first time, they never would have guessed that one of the largest utility investigations our local electric cooperative had handled in years had started on that quiet strip of land. Life has a way of hiding yesterday's lessons beneath today's routines. The official reports were eventually completed, responsibility was assigned through the proper legal and administrative channels, and the homeowners association adopted entirely new procedures requiring verification with utility providers before approving any project involving easements, marked corridors, or critical infrastructure. Contractors working inside Silver Ridge Estates now receive copies of county utility maps before beginning exterior improvements. Survey markers were no longer treated as decoration. Warning signs were no longer considered visual clutter. They had become reminders that some boundaries exist for reasons far greater than appearance. I never celebrated any of it. There was nothing satisfying about watching neighbors spend an unexpected evening without electricity or seeing a community forced to learn an expensive lesson. Most of the residents had done nothing wrong. They simply trusted that the people making decisions understood the limits of their authority. Over time, several homeowners stopped by my workshop, not because they needed engineering advice, but because they wanted to understand what had really happened beyond the rumors. I showed them old survey drawings, explained how recorded easements protect public services, and described why documentation matters more than assumptions. Those conversations were far more rewarding than any courtroom victory ever could have been. Even Victoria crossed paths with me one afternoon while I was checking vegetation clearance near the rebuilt corridor. She walked over quietly, looked at the restored utility markers for a long moment, and simply said, "I should have listened the first time you explained it." There was no argument left to win, so I nodded and wished her a good afternoon. Sometimes accountability arrives not through dramatic confrontations, but through the quiet realization that confidence is never a substitute for knowledge. Before leaving, she glanced once more at the easement stretching across the edge of my land, almost as though she finally saw what had always been there. That simple strip of grass had never been empty space. It carried responsibility, history, engineering, and the trust of every family whose lights depended on it. I still keep the original survey map folded inside a weatherproof tube in my workshop. Not because I expect another dispute, but because it reminds me that the strongest protection is often a well-documented fact preserved long before anyone challenges it. Every time I hear the gentle hum returning through those lines at sunset, I think about my father teaching me that invisible boundaries shape the visible world. He was right. Property lines, easements, engineering standards, and public records rarely attract attention until someone decides they no longer matter. Then they become the only things that do. In the end, nobody won because the lights went out. Justice came because the truth stayed connected from the very beginning. The evidence spoke louder than assumptions, patience outlasted authority, and the law followed the same path electricity always does. It does not care who speaks the loudest. It only follows the lines that were built the right way.